In the dead of a Texas night, the air hung thick with the smell of iron and dust, and the low cry of a wolf echoed across the pine-swept hills. Bastrop, 1847, a town that claimed itself righteous, cloaked in the cross and the law, hid a darkness no ledger or preacher dared record. In a small cabin near the edge of the Colorado River, a man named Ezekiel Holloway was sold to the highest bidder. What those who purchased him could not have imagined was that his chains were never meant to bind him, but to awaken something older, more precise, and unforgiving. Ezekiel's eyes, dark as river mud, carried the weight of something ancestral, a quiet fury that no whip or courtroom could quell. They said he was a slave, but in the nights that followed, each man who took ownership of him disappeared, vanished without trace, leaving only the faint imprint of blood and the whisper of scorched wood. Townsfolk told themselves he was cursed, a madman, a devil in human skin, but in the shadows of churches and orphanages, in the corridors of seminaries, whispers told another story, of a hidden reckoning, meticulous, almost surgical, carried out in silence, leaving no evidence of struggle save the lingering terror in the families who had dared by him. The story was buried deep, erased from records, dismissed as rumor or hysteria. Yet in the rusted chains and faded letters hidden in a pastor's attic, the truth waited, patient and relentless. The kind of truth that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Thomas Whitaker, a man whose pride was measured in acres and the weight of his ledger, believed he had purchased nothing more than labor. The auction house had called Ezekiel a docile asset, a quiet soul who would bend to any command. But Whitaker's confidence was the first mistake, a miscalculation that would stain his name in ways the town would never speak aloud. Ezekiel arrived at Whitaker's plantation on a sunless morning, his steps silent, deliberate, as if he had already measured the distance to every corner of the house, every shadowed hallway. Whitaker watched him with the satisfaction of ownership, unaware of the cold, precise awareness behind those dark eyes. The boy, for that is how Whitaker thought of him, never asked questions, never complained, but he listened. He catalogued. He waited. On the third night, a scream split the air, sharp and sudden, like a rifle's report in the stillness. Neighbors would later claim it was an accident, some misfired lantern or a drunken brawl, but the truth was far more deliberate. When Whitaker's body was found the next morning, sprawled unnaturally across the floor of his study, there were no signs of intrusion, no footprints, no weapon, but the ledger lay open, pages stained, as if the numbers themselves had been punished. Ezekiel stood outside the doorway, silent, unshaken, as the family reeled in disbelief. The authorities called it a tragedy, whispered about madness, and moved on. But those who looked closely, who knew where to see, noticed the faint scorch marks on the wooden floorboards, the lingering scent of iron in the air. This was only the beginning. By the time word of Thomas Whitaker's death reached the wider county, a hush had fallen over Bastrop. Families who had once boasted of ownership over slaves began whispering in locked parlors, their voices trembling with a fear they did not fully understand. No one openly accused Ezekiel Holloway. He was still just a boy, but the air around him carried a weight that pressed against every conscience. Windows shuddered, dogs barked endlessly, and even the church bells seemed reluctant to toll. Then came the second owner, Richard Calloway, a man whose cruelty was spoken of in both taverns and Sunday sermons. He treated Ezekiel as property, a tool for punishment and toil, never once considering that the boy's silence was not fear, but calculation. Within weeks, Calloway vanished. The townspeople found his home empty, dinner still on the table, bed unmade, and the hearth smoldering with a faint, unnatural heat. Letters later discovered in the county archives, blackened and brittle, contained nothing but Ezekiel's signature, a small, looping mark beneath Calloway's name, as if claiming ownership of the act itself. The pattern was undeniable. Every man who sought to possess him met a fate both precise and untraceable. Children of the victims whispered his name at night, while ministers avoided the subject entirely, fearing questions that could unravel the very fabric of their congregations. Ezekiel moved through the town like a shadow, silent, observing, and yet somehow everywhere. Townsfolk began to speak of him as more than human, a living reckoning, a spectral instrument of justice, meticulous and eternal. No one could explain it. No one could stop it. And the true horror, the one hidden behind the veil of superstition, was that Ezekiel's wrath was only the surface of something far older, a trauma rooted in centuries, passed silently through the generations. By the spring of 1848, Bastrop itself seemed to breathe in fear. The streets were quieter, as if the very town had learned to step lightly, afraid to disturb some hidden balance. Farmers spoke in clipped sentences, neighbors avoided eye contact, and children stopped playing near the riverbank where Ezekiel sometimes lingered, watching. Every family that had bought him, or even considered it, felt a chill settle into their bones, the kind of cold that gnaws at sleep and sanity alike. The church, once Bastrop's moral heart, became a place of trembling hypocrisy. Ministers offered prayers for lost souls, but never named Ezekiel. Orphanages, which had once taken pride in their discipline, suddenly became prisons of hushed warnings, children taught not to speak of him. Even the local magistrates, sworn to uphold law and order, hesitated to act. Their ledgers contained no mention of Ezekiel's disappearances, no evidence of the men who vanished in their care. In the quiet corners of their offices, some admitted a creeping suspicion. Perhaps the boy was an instrument, a reckoning they did not deserve to witness. At night, those who dared remain awake reported strange phenomena. Footprints leading nowhere, faint murmurs through shuttered windows, the metallic tang of blood lingering in the air. And always, Ezekiel's gaze seemed to follow, patient and unyielding, as if cataloging the sins of every soul in town. Bastrop had become a cage of invisible terror, where the unseen hand of vengeance dictated movement, conversation, even thought. The horror was no longer contained to the missing men. It seeped into the families, twisting their nights with nightmares of judgment and exposure. Bastrop's rot was not only in flesh, but in conscience. And Ezekiel, ever silent, ever deliberate, remained the axis of it all, a quiet storm gathering strength, waiting to strike again. On the outskirts of Bastrop stood the St. Agnes Orphanage, a grim building of brick and shadow, where the children's laughter had long since been replaced by the soft drip of despair. The sisters who ran it were devout, meticulous, and cruel in equal measure, punishing small transgressions with rigid hands and silent threats. Yet even they recoiled the day Ezekiel arrived, not as a charge, but as a visitor. He walked through the halls with a patience that unnerved the staff, observing the children as if reading their hidden fears, tallying the unspoken horrors of their upbringing. In the dormitories, the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with damp straw and sorrow. In the classrooms, chalk scraped across blackboards like fingernails on bone. Ezekiel's presence turned the ordinary into something sinister. Small gestures became foreboding omens, a glance a quiet accusation. Soon after, the orphanage's overseers began to vanish. Father Murdoch, who had turned blind eyes to punishments, was found beneath the floorboards, his body arranged with almost ritualistic precision. Sister Agatha disappeared, leaving only a trail of her own blood, winding like a crimson thread through the hallways. The children spoke in whispers, claiming they saw the boy in corners where no child should be, eyes reflecting something older than memory itself. No one outside the orphanage dared investigate. Rumors spread through Bastrop's churches and taverns. A curse, divine retribution, or a reckoning too terrible to name. Yet the truth was quieter, more calculated. Ezekiel was uncovering, exposing, and punishing the corruption buried in institutions meant to shelter the innocent. His vengeance was not chaos. It was meticulous, surgical, and terrifyingly deliberate. And in the silence that followed each disappearance, a darker question began to take hold. If Ezekiel could reach into the heart of an orphanage, what else lay within his grasp? Perched on a hill overlooking Bastrop, the St. Michael's Seminary was a fortress of faith, learning, and whispered secrets. Its spires pierced the sky, but within, shadows gathered like a congregation of silent sinners. The seminarians, boys cloaked in innocence, were taught doctrines of virtue while observing hypocrisies the church never named. And into this place of controlled piety came Ezekiel Holloway, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. He arrived one overcast morning, carrying nothing but himself and the weight of something ancestral, something the town dared not name. Professors regarded him with curiosity, suspecting him a simple traveler. But the moment Ezekiel walked the hallways, an unsettling tension rippled through the stone corridors. Candles flickered without wind. The echo of footsteps sounded where no one walked. He studied each man, cataloging sins unconfessed, and noticing the smallest acts of cruelty, the concealed abuses hidden beneath layers of ritual and prayer. Then, like the pattern before, the disappearances began. Father Whitmore, a teacher whose sermons were strict but whose hands punished behind closed doors, vanished from his quarters, leaving only the faint scent of iron in the air. His replacement, Father Ellison, was discovered days later, perfectly arranged beneath the chapel floor, eyes wide in silent accusation. The seminarians whispered in terror, some claiming they glimpsed Ezekiel in empty classrooms, eyes dark, always watching. Bastrup's churches had never faced such unrelenting scrutiny. Ezekiel was not simply enacting vengeance. He was unmasking every shadow, forcing the town to confront the corruption it had nurtured. And yet, no one could stop him, for his methods left no evidence, no confession, only the rising dread that the sins of the powerful could be punished by a hand beyond comprehension, patient and precise. By the autumn of 1848, the tremors of Ezekiel Holloway's vengeance had reached every corner of Bastrop. Families who once flaunted their wealth now whispered behind tightly closed doors, eyes darting toward shadows that might conceal the boy, or something far older than he appeared. No one slept soundly. The very walls seemed to remember past sins, murmuring reminders of every injustice perpetrated within. Ezekiel did not need to strike every household. His presence alone was enough to unravel them. A child in the Whitaker family refused to eat, murmuring of eyes that followed them in the dark. The Calloways found scratches on doors and furniture, shallow but deliberate, as if the house itself bore witness to the unrepented cruelty of its masters. And in the pockets of the wealthy and the clergy alike, letters appeared, and signed, precise, and accusatory, cataloging sins no ledger had recorded. Parents huddled over supper, faces pale, as unspoken dread filled the air. The town's lawyers, politicians, and merchants convened in secret, debating what action could be taken, yet no man dared approach Ezekiel. He moved through Bastrop like a shadow within shadows, silent, deliberate, observing, and marking the guilty. His punishment was surgical, invisible to outsiders, but it left an imprint that infected every mind it touched. By now, Bastrop had become a town of the terrified and the complicit. Fear was not confined to the absent men. It had leached into every home, every room, every bed. Children whispered in the night. Servants woke to shadows where no one stood. And through it all, Ezekiel remained outside the law, beyond vengeance, an instrument of reckoning no one could resist. The town realized something terrible. This was no ordinary vengeance. This was a methodical, relentless excavation of their sins, and the deeper the roots, the more patient and merciless the hand that exposed them. The Colorado River, winding like a dark serpent through Bastrop, became more than a geographic feature. It became a silent witness to the town's unraveling. Its waters carried secrets, whispers of sins that no preacher dared name, and reflections that seemed to twist reality itself. Townsfolk began avoiding its banks at dusk, for even the light of a fading sun could not erase the shadows lurking in its ripples. Ezekiel Holloway often appeared near the river, though no one knew from where. He moved with a patience that mirrored the slow current, as if the river itself were his ally, carrying away evidence while amplifying fear. Those who dared to fish or walk along its banks sometimes saw him staring back from the water's surface, not a reflection of flesh and bone, but something darker, older, a presence that recorded their guilt in silence. It was there that Ezekiel's victims were found, or perhaps left. A boot bobbing in the current, a hand caught in reeds, sometimes a body hidden beneath mud, pristine and undisturbed, arranged in a manner that suggested ritual rather than chaos. The river did not rush, it did not speak, it only observed, holding these secrets as if complicit in the boy's calculated retribution. Families whispered that the river had a memory, that it remembered every sin committed on its shores. The priests avoided mentioning it. The magistrates pretended not to notice. But the children, the servants, the widows, those most attuned to the town's quiet terror, knew the river was not neutral. It was an accomplice, a mirror, and a warning. In Bastrop, even water had turned against them. And Ezekiel, like the river, remained untouchable, flowing through their lives with inevitability and purpose, leaving behind only dread in his wake. By winter, Bastrop was no longer a town. It was a cage of trembling hearts. And then came the letters. They arrived without warning, slipped under doors or pinned to gates with crude nails, each one sealed in wax that smelled faintly of iron and ash. There were no postmarks, no signatures, save for one mark, a small, looping symbol that only those who had dealt with Ezekiel recognized. The letters were simple, precise, and chillingly intimate. They named sins, cataloged transgressions, detailed cruelty and neglect with surgical clarity. One letter addressed the Whitaker family, listing every lash inflicted on the enslaved, every dishonest ledger entry, every whispered insult in the dead of night. Another addressed the orphanage, enumerating each hidden punishment inflicted on the children, the nights spent weeping under cold blankets. No one could deny their accuracy, and no one could trace their origin. Parents and magistrates huddled in private, terrified and guilty, reading aloud lines that felt as though the words themselves had weight, each letter a tally, each sentence a blade. Ministers were confronted with their hypocrisies, merchants with their exploitation. Even those who had not directly wronged Ezekiel felt the pressure of exposure, as if the letters could peer into the soul of anyone complicit in silence. And always, in the shadows of Bastrop, Ezekiel observed. He did not need to act violently each time. The letters alone were sufficient to bend conscience, to fracture families, to erode trust. Bastrop's streets were now lined not just with fear, but with the creeping certainty that nothing hidden could remain so. The boy's reach was everywhere, precise and inevitable, like the slow accumulation of frost on a window pane, cold, silent, and impossible to reverse. Bastrop's churches had long claimed moral authority, their spires rising like sentinels over the town. Yet by winter's end, the sanctity they preached had crumbled, replaced by fear that gnawed at their conscience. The ministers, once confident in their righteous judgment, now spoke in hushed tones, avoiding Ezekiel's name as if even saying it aloud could summon calamity. Father Langley, who had once dismissed rumors of vanished men as superstition, trembled as he reviewed one of the letters. Each sin outlined, the hidden punishments, the misappropriated funds, the whispered betrayals, was undeniable, yet delivered without accusation or plea. It was an indictment, precise and surgical, leaving the reader exposed, defenseless, and utterly alone. Other clergy received similar letters. Each contained truths that no confessional could absolve. Each forced the keepers of faith to confront their corruption. Worshippers began noticing changes in the sermons. Hesitations, tremors, glances toward the door, an underlying terror that replaced piety. Parishioners whispered to each other of a boy whose vengeance was unstoppable, whose sight penetrated even the most hidden sins. The clergy's silence became a language itself, a terrified compliance, a concession to power they could not comprehend, a tacit acknowledgement that their authority had limits when faced with something older, more precise than any human law. By now, it was clear, Bastrop's moral hierarchy had been inverted. Power no longer resided in wealth, law, or faith. It resided with Ezekiel Holloway. His judgments, slow and deliberate, had begun to reach beyond those who directly harmed him. Everyone in Bastrop, from the richest merchant to the youngest servant, now lived in the shadow of a reckoning that spared no hypocrisy. The town had learned an immutable truth. Some sins are not forgotten. They are catalogued, measured, and punished with a patience that spans lifetimes. In the attic of the Whitaker estate, behind a loose floorboard and layers of dust, a ledger was discovered. Not a conventional ledger of finances, but one that catalogued every injustice, cruelty, and betrayal that had transpired in Bastrop over decades. Names were written in precise, deliberate hand. Men who had traded human lives, priests who had turned a blind eye, merchants who profited from suffering. And at the bottom of each entry, a small looping mark. Ezekiel Holloway's signature, silent but absolute. It was the kind of document that could unravel an entire town. Bastrup's citizens, long comfortable in their delusions of innocence, suddenly faced the terrifying reality that someone, or something, was watching, recording, and judging. The ledger left no ambiguity. Each cruel act was paired with meticulous details: dates, times, locations, and outcomes. It was as if Ezekiel had become a historian of human sin, chronicling transgressions with a patience that bordered on the obsessive. The town's authorities, long complicit in the maintenance of social hierarchies, found themselves powerless. Courts could not prosecute what was already inevitable. Families who thought themselves untouchable were reduced to whispers and fear. The ledger became a symbol, a mirror reflecting Bastrup's collective corruption back at its people, and the more they read, the more they realized that no one could hide. Ezekiel's vengeance was no longer personal. It had become systemic, exposing the rot embedded in every institution. Churches, orphanages, plantations, homes, they were all implicated. And while no one knew how he accomplished his disappearances, the ledger proved his reach was limitless, silent, precise, and merciless. Bastrup was learning a brutal truth. When history is recorded in blood and witness, it waits patiently, like a predator, for the moment to strike. By the following spring, Bastrup's nights were no longer a refuge. Darkness had become a presence, thick and oppressive, crawling into bedrooms and settling over the town like a living shroud. Children awoke screaming, haunted by visions of a boy whose eyes were too dark, too knowing, staring from corners they had never seen. Servants whispered of footsteps pacing hallways long after the lamps were extinguished, the metallic tang of blood hanging faintly in the air. Ezekiel's vengeance had evolved beyond the physical. It entered minds, unmooring reason and twisting dreams into vivid, unbearable reflections of guilt. Parents who had punished slaves, children, or servants found themselves reliving every act of cruelty in meticulous detail. They woke in cold sweat, clutching at sheets and walls, hearts pounding against the invisible weight of accusation. And always, in the periphery of every nightmare, Ezekiel waited, silent, patient, cataloging their terror as if it were another page in his ever-growing ledger of sins. Even the church could not shelter the faithful. Pews were abandoned at night. Confessions went unmade, for the very act of speech seemed insufficient to erase the silent, watchful judgment Ezekiel imposed. Townsfolk began leaving candles in windows, muttering prayers that no one believed would work. Bastrup's sleep had been stolen, replaced by endless, unrelenting vigilance against a threat no one could confront directly. And yet, in this terror, Ezekiel remained almost invisible. No chains, no weapons, no brute force. Only the slow, suffocating certainty that every sin would be discovered and every sinner measured. The psychological grip on Bastrup was complete. The town had entered a state of perpetual nightmare, and the boy at its center was no longer merely human. He was the embodiment of judgment itself, patient, unyielding, and eternal. By summer, Bastrup's prominent families were unraveling. Wealth and status, once shields against consequence, were now meaningless under Ezekiel Holloway's relentless gaze. The Whitakers no longer dined together. The eldest son refused to speak, haunted by visions of his father's demise. The Calloways abandoned their estate, fearful that the house itself might conspire with the boy. Each household became a microcosm of terror, secrets unspooling, whispered confessions spilling into the air like smoke. Ezekiel did not strike with visible violence. He struck at structure. Financial records were tampered with mysteriously. Debts appeared where none had existed. Servants vanished from houses with no explanation, leaving behind silent, accusing eyes in the portraits and mirrors. Children learned to fear the very walls that had sheltered them. Parents learned to fear their own thoughts, haunted by memories they had carefully buried. Every corner of Bastrup seemed to remember its transgressions, echoing Ezekiel's meticulous judgment. The town's social hierarchy, once rigid and unquestioned, collapsed under the weight of invisible terror. Ministers, magistrates, and merchants could no longer assert authority. Families who had once defined Bastrup now existed in a state of trembling, fractured compliance. Every whispered conversation carried suspicion, Every glance became a test of loyalty or guilt. Bastrop had become a town held captive not by chains or law, but by the patient, precise hand of a single boy. Ezekiel's vengeance had evolved into inevitability. The sins of generations, slavery, cruelty, exploitation, hidden corruption, were now tangible forces shaping the daily lives of the guilty. Bastrop's foundations, once solid, were cracked, and no human effort could repair them. The boy had become more than a person. He was the measure of justice itself, silent, omnipresent, and merciless. By late summer, Bastrop had grown accustomed to the feeling of being watched, not by neighbors or authorities, but by something far quieter, more deliberate. Ezekiel Holloway's presence had become a specter, a shadow in every room, a ripple in every action. The townsfolk moved as if strings bound them, careful in speech, cautious in gesture, haunted by the certainty that every thought, every hidden act of cruelty, could be exposed at any moment. The boy's reach extended beyond families into institutions that had long claimed moral or social authority. The orphanage, churches, seminaries, all were now trembling under his silent judgment. Teachers caught themselves counting wrong, misreading lessons, terrified that mistakes might be noted, catalogued, punished. Clergy prayed fervently for mercy that would not come. Magistrates stared at empty courtrooms, wondering if justice itself had shifted into unseen hands. Every system meant to control, to shelter, to order, was undermined by the simple, relentless fact of Ezekiel's observation. No one knew how he achieved it. Sometimes a servant would disappear, leaving a door swinging open, a candle extinguished. Sometimes letters arrived, listing truths no one had dared to confess. And sometimes, all that remained was the subtle imprint of his judgment. A family dinner left untouched, an estate abandoned, a ledger filled with sins they had thought hidden. The town realized, collectively, that they were no longer masters of their own lives. The unseen watchers, Ezekiel among them, held Bastrop in a grip stronger than chains, subtler than fear of law, more complete than the threat of violence. And in every shadow, the people could feel him waiting, patient, inevitable, and merciless. Among the few who survived Ezekiel's methodical reckoning, widows and exiles whispered warnings to one another. One such woman, Mrs. Calloway, ventured cautiously into town, her face drawn and pale, clutching a bundle of letters and charred remnants of ledgers. Her voice trembled as she spoke of a boy who did not merely punish. It observed, catalogued, and executed with a precision that no law could comprehend. "Do not look for him," she warned. "Do not call him by name. He is patient, and he remembers everything. Every cruelty, every lie, every hidden debt of conscience. If he finds it in you, it will not matter what walls you build. He will claim it." Her warning spread like a contagion, igniting terror even in the homes that had not directly wronged Ezekiel. Bastrop became a town suspended in perpetual unease. Families no longer dared leave their estates. Meals went cold on tables, beds remained unmade. The streets emptied at dusk, and even the church's spires seemed to recoil, shadows stretching unnaturally across the brick walls. Yet Ezekiel's influence was not solely physical. It had permeated the psyche of the town. Those who read the widow's letters or listened to her tales found themselves waking in the middle of the night, recalling past misdeeds with agonizing clarity. Guilt became an omnipresent companion, a constant reminder that no sin could be hidden. And somewhere, always somewhere, Ezekiel waited. He did not need to strike immediately. Fear was his tool, his weapon, and his shield. Bastrop had learned, far too late, that the boy's patience was as inexorable as the river that carried the town's whispers, and his reckoning would continue until every sin was accounted for. By autumn, the Colorado River had become more than a silent witness. It had assumed the role of executioner. The townsfolk whispered that the waters themselves obeyed Ezekiel Holloway, carrying away bodies and secrets alike. Those who dared approach its banks often found themselves frozen by the sensation of unseen eyes, a pressure in the air that weighed heavier than stone. The river no longer reflected sunlight or moonlight with serenity. It mirrored guilt, dread, and the inevitability of judgment. Ezekiel's victims continued to vanish, their bodies sometimes discovered downstream, arranged in patterns that defied natural explanation. The river's banks bore subtle signs, footprints that began and ended in mud, pools of water tinged with iron, reeds bent into unnatural formations. Observers swore the current itself seemed to guide him, silent and deliberate, as if the very flow of water was orchestrating the boy's meticulous work. Families living near the river began barricading their homes, but even distance could not insulate them. The river's presence, its silent observance, invaded dreams, whispered warnings in the night, and became a constant reminder that Bastrop itself was complicit in the sins Ezekiel now punished. Children refused to play along the shore, servants avoided fetching water, merchants halted deliveries. Life was suspended under a canopy of apprehension, and even the town's authority figures dared not interfere. The Colorado had become a tool, a co-conspirator, a conduit for Ezekiel's judgment. Its waters recorded and reflected every act of cruelty, amplifying fear and enforcing obedience. Bastrop had learned, through terror and loss, that the land itself could be weaponized against those who thought themselves untouchable, and that Ezekiel's patience was as inexorable as the river's eternal flow. The children of Bastrop had learned to fear the shadows long before they understood the nature of sin. At St. Agnes Orphanage, where discipline had once been cruel but predictable, Ezekiel Holloway's presence transformed fear into something unrelenting and pervasive. The children became silent witnesses, absorbing terror as one might inhale air, unavoidable, suffocating, and shaping every thought. At night, whispers carried through the dormitories, not of the boy himself, but of the invisible ledger he maintained in every mind. Children described waking to see him standing at the edge of their beds, eyes dark pools of patience and judgment, recording every misdeed, every harsh word spoken, every glance of disobedience. No matter how small the act, it was catalogued, measured, and understood, leaving them trembling beneath the weight of unseen scrutiny. Orphans avoided one another's eyes, fearful that the smallest accusation might invoke Ezekiel's attention. Servants began to notice the children's quiet obsession, their careful movement through the halls, and the way their innocence had become a vessel for collective fear. No child played openly, no voice laughed freely. All actions were moderated by the awareness of a gaze they could not evade. Even the adults observed, unnerved, recognizing that the corruption of innocence was as potent a force as any vanishing or ledger entry. Ezekiel's influence was no longer solely a threat to the guilty. It was a mechanism by which the town's future was shaped by terror. Bastrop's youngest inhabitants internalized the omnipresent judgment, learning that disobedience, cruelty, or silence could all bear consequences far beyond understanding. In the town's children, fear had become instinct, and the shadow of Ezekiel Holloway stretched into the next generation, patient, precise, and inescapable. By late autumn, Bastrop's magistrates had come to a grim realization. Law, power, and social standing were impotent against Ezekiel Holloway. Magistrate Samuel Kerr, a man once proud of his office and unwavering in judgment, found himself trembling before the boy's silent authority. He admitted, in a letter scrawled hastily and hidden beneath the floorboards, that every attempt to intervene had failed. Every investigation had ended in disappearance, every inquiry in frustration and dread. Kerr's confession was a study in helplessness. He described following rumors of missing men to distant estates, only to find rooms empty, doors locked from within, evidence wiped clean as if the act had never occurred. He confessed to confronting families, ministers, and merchants, only to be met with terror, silence, or fragmented testimony that revealed nothing and condemned everything. Bastrop's institutions, once pillars of stability, were now hollowed by fear and inaction. The magistrate wrote of Ezekiel himself, how the boy seemed ordinary yet impossibly patient, observant beyond comprehension. He does not strike unless necessary, Kerr admitted. But even in silence, his presence commands the town more than I ever could. He detailed the ledger, the letters, the vanished servants, and the unsettling perfection with which Ezekiel orchestrated judgment. Every sin had a cost, every act of cruelty a precise accounting. Kerr's final lines carried resignation and horror. He acknowledged that Bastrop's authority had been dismantled, that justice no longer resided in men, but in the methodical hand of the boy who catalogued and punished. His confession ended with a warning, addressed to no one in particular. That vigilance, morality, and conscience were the only shields left, and even these might prove insufficient against a reckoning older and more patient than any human authority could confront. By winter's onset, Ezekiel Holloway's ledger was no longer a fragment of hidden observations. It had become a full chronicle of Bastrup's sins. Every family, every minister, every merchant and magistrate who had tolerated cruelty or exploited innocence was accounted for, their actions meticulously recorded, and their consequences silently executed. The ledger was not merely a book. It was a testament, a mirror of human corruption, and a blueprint of judgment beyond law, reason, or mercy. The town itself seemed to recognize the ledger's completion. Estates stood silent, doors left ajar, servants vanished without explanation. Families huddled in fear, eyes darting to shadows, hearts pounding with unspoken guilt. Even the church, once a bastion of authority, trembled under the weight of exposure. Ezekiel did not need to act overtly. His work had already transformed Bastrup into a town of perpetual vigilance and internalized terror. Those who glimpsed the ledger described it in hushed tones, pages filled with names and deeds, written with a precision and clarity that suggested not anger, but inevitability. Each entry was paired with the subtle notation of its consequence, demonstrating Ezekiel's patient orchestration of justice. The town had become a living tableau of accountability, morality enforced not by law or fear of men, but by the quiet, unstoppable will of a single boy. And yet, even as the ledger neared its final entries, Bastrup sensed that Ezekiel's work was not complete. The town's sins had been exposed, its complicit institutions revealed, its families fractured, but the presence of the boy remained. He was no longer merely a figure of vengeance. He was the embodiment of reckoning itself, a patient, relentless force ensuring that the town would never forget, never escape, and never again pretend that wrongdoing could remain hidden. Years passed, but Bastrup never returned to the world it once knew. The town existed in suspended time, a place where walls remembered cruelty, streets murmured guilt, and the river whispered judgment. Ezekiel Holloway had vanished from sight, yet his presence was eternal, woven into the fabric of every household, every church, every orphanage. He was not merely a boy who punished. He was a witness, a ledger made flesh, an inevitability that could never be undone. Parents taught children to walk softly, not in obedience to law, but in reverence to a moral force invisible yet omnipresent. Ministers adjusted sermons to preempt judgment they could not see. Magistrates avoided decisions that might summon attention. Even the natural world seemed to bend under the memory of Ezekiel's actions. The river flowed silently, the wind whispered through the pines, and shadows lingered long after the sun had set. Bastrup had learned the true cost of complicity. Cruelty, greed, and hidden sins were catalogued not by men, but by a presence patient and precise, capable of teaching lessons far beyond corporal punishment. The ledger, the letters, the vanishings, they were all part of a single design, a relentless pedagogy in fear and accountability. Ezekiel Holloway remained, in memory and effect, the eternal witness. The boy whose vengeance had begun as personal became symbolic, embodying the moral conscience of an entire town. Bastrup's people understood now. Some judgments are not delivered by courts, chains, or fire. They are carried quietly, patiently, and inexorably by those who cannot be resisted. And somewhere, in the corners of every mind, Bastrup knew he was still there, watching, cataloging, waiting, for sins are never truly forgotten, and the ledger of humanity's darkness is eternal.